put us back in a sampan. At this point, the man we'd been talking to, who said he could guarantee our legs, appeared, and his reticence was now gone. He was now in Viet Cong territory, which clearly he was a part of and comfortable with, and he was now smiling, much more comfortable than he was before. And he took us in his sampan down a canal, where within a few minutes we saw, the proverbial Viet Cong soldiers in black pajamas carrying AK-47s on the side of the canal, just looking at us. A sight that I don't think any journalist had seen before without that rifle being aimed at them. That was just jaw-dropping for us.
Welcome to Whiskey and a Map, stories of adventure and exploration as told by those who live them. In this special episode, we are joined by award-winning war correspondent Jacques Leslie. Jacques covered the wars in Vietnam and Cambodia, as well as the Indira Gandhi crisis in India. An eyewitness to history whose work documented the horrible realities of conflict. This episode is brought to you by michaelreinhardtphotography.com. Look around you. Does your room inspire your adventurous spirit? I travel to the world's wild places to bring back its stories and images. These exotic photographs are available at michaelreinhardtphotography.com. There you will find photographic art guaranteed to stir your adventurous soul. Use promo code WHISKEY and get 30% off. A link below is in the show notes. Thank you for your support of my work. Now back to the interview. Jacques, welcome to the podcast. This is a special edition of Whiskey and a Map, and really appreciate you joining us. How are you doing this morning?
I'm doing very well. Thank you, Michael.
Excellent. We can see the forest behind you. That looks beautiful out there.
We're in rural Vermont, which is one of the beautiful places in the world.
Nice. Jacques, I want to start off with what led you to Vietnam and working as a war correspondent. Can you tell us about that?
Oh, in some ways, I was an accidental war correspondent. I had gone through college and worked on the college paper thinking that I would have a career as a journalist in the United States. And when I graduated, there was a program that attracted me, which involved teaching English for 2 years at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. And I thought this would be my last chance to get an extended amount of time outside the country before working inside the country. So I applied for that program and was accepted and spent 2 years in Hong Kong. And that really changed my life. There was a lot of free time, and there were also free Chinese lessons offered. So I decided to take these Chinese lessons and spent 2 years studying the language intensively. And it really requires intensive study because it's so different from English. And that led to my becoming a foreign correspondent.
Well, how did it change you? You went there right after college and you said it drastically changed your trajectory. How so?
Oh, well, after I did that for 2 years, I came back to the United States, started working as a freelance journalist in Washington, and happened to hear from a friend of mine that there might be that there was a job that the Los Angeles Times had offered to a young Chinese speaker. And the idea was to train him in Vietnam so that eventually he could cover China, which was then showing signs of opening up to American correspondents. It hadn't yet done that, but that's what the foreign editor of the LA Times was thinking. He'd already hired somebody else, a man named Frank Aller, who was a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford and also was a draft dodger. And Bob Gibson, the foreign editor, arranged with his draft board for him to be able to come back to the United States without penalty. He then spent a few months on the foreign desk of the LA Times learning how it worked. And then, quite shockingly, 3 days before he was supposed to go to Saigon, committed suicide.
Oh, wow.
This was a man who had been Bill Clinton's roommate at Oxford, certainly had a lot of skills, but I never learned what sort of emotional difficulties he had. But when I did hear that he had died, I then applied myself and I was accepted. And so I spent, a couple of months on the foreign desk before I went off to Vietnam without thinking about committing suicide.
So, what was it that changed your mind from working within the States as a journalist to seeking out that position?
It was an extraordinary opportunity. It usually took journalists many years before they'd be offered a foreign correspondent job. And the idea of covering what then seemed like the most important story in the world was, what we'd call now a no-brainer. I saw that most journalists who went to Vietnam survived, came back, and I figured my odds were pretty good. And so I thought it was a risk worth taking.
Now, how long were you in country in Vietnam?
I was there for 19 months altogether. Um, I was expelled from South Vietnam, or it would have been 2 years. But they were a highly eventful, really transformative part of my life. I was forever changed by that experience. And I'm imagine we'll talk about how.
Exactly. You wrote a book about it called The Mark, and the mark has a special meaning for you. What do you mean by the mark?
The mark was a term I first heard from a friend of mine, Nick Prophet, who was the Newsweek bureau chief in Saigon. And he would say, "Oh, he has the mark." And what that meant was that whoever had the mark was somebody who was just addicted to the war. And it didn't really matter what your political beliefs about the war were. It just was the combination of adrenaline and observing just one extraordinary thing after another. It made life in the United States pale by comparison. And that certainly applied to me. And that's why I called the book that. I was someone who went to Vietnam with no knowledge of the military whatsoever. I didn't even know the order of officers' ranks, although I quickly learned that. But I was really inexperienced in military affairs. But I learned fairly quickly. And in the beginning, I was absolutely terrified the first time I got anywhere close to a battle. But each time I got close to a battle, I can't say that I lost my fear, but I began to be able to understand when I was in great danger and when I was not in so much danger. And that began to give me some confidence, and so that I was able to keep on doing it. And then I began to not particularly like combat. I did not spend much time close to combat. And at that point in the war, which was beginning in January of 1972, the American withdrawal was already underway. And what American troops did was of less interest to U.S. editors. The U.S. Army presence at its peak in Vietnam was 500,000 soldiers. When I got there in January 72, it was down to 100,000. So there were times when it seemed appropriate to do something with soldiers, but I didn't do that too much. There were lots of other things to do.
And what were those other things that you were really interested in covering at the time?
Well, I found one thing that was missing from a lot of coverage was what happened to Vietnamese civilians and what happened to refugees, of whom there were a huge number. And in April of 72, the Easter Offensive began when the North Vietnamese swept across the demilitarized zone, captured some territory at the very north, and sent quite a few civilians literally underground. They just lived in trenches, essentially, while this region was being bombed by U.S. planes and ships off the coast. And when this phase of the fighting stopped and the North Vietnamese pulled back a bit, as I remember, these people started emerging. And I began interviewing them, and I found their stories of what they'd experienced astonishing and appalling, and bodies lying close to them, watching dogs eating those bodies. Just horrific things that they'd somehow come out and they seemed still whole. So that was the beginning of that part of my interest. But even more important than that, I should say, was that I felt I was on a mission to report what wasn't getting reported to the American people. It sounds a bit presumptuous now, but that certainly was on my mind. And that led to a long list of exclusive stories that I did that began with my becoming the first American journalist to go into Viet Cong territory in South Vietnam and come out and write about it. And that was the most amazing day of my life. Nothing could come close. And it was, what we saw was quite unexpected. This began when we started hearing rumors that there were ceasefire negotiations going on. This was in the fall of 1972. And then Henry Kissinger announced that peace was at hand. I think that was in October. And so there really was a sense that a ceasefire was coming. And I got a request from my editor to try to find out how the Viet Cong, also called, or what they call themselves with the National Liberation Front, how they were preparing for this ceasefire. So together with my interpreter, a wonderful and courageous Vietnamese man named Pham Phi Lom, and another journalist I did quite a few stories with, Véronique Descoudeux of Agence France Presse, we went down into the Mekong Delta with the somewhat naive, crazy idea that we could go up to villagers and ask them, well, how's the NLF preparing for this? And it really shouldn't have worked at all. And I think the first morning that we tried this, it didn't work. I mean, Vietnamese were far too cagey to talk to an American they didn't understand and tell them something as sensitive as that. But
Well, at the
Lom,
time,
yeah.
Jacques, at the time, though, no journalists had done this before, had they?
Well, just doing that story wouldn't have been that astounding. I mean, that's something that presumably could have been obtained by talking to civilians, to villagers. There was no particular risk in that. But it wasn't until we met a couple of people who turned out to be working for the Viet Cong that we started thinking, I think we can go into Viet Cong territory. What happened is that our interpreter said, I think I know a couple of men who can help us with this story, and brought us to them. And to my amazement, they began telling us what they were doing, and we didn't know who they were. Lom had said that they were involved in a third-party campaign, which would not have been Viet Cong, but who knows why they were involved in that. But anyway, as we sat down with them and asked them questions, they enthusiastically recited a list of 26 points that they had memorized about things to be done in preparation for a ceasefire. Things like burying weapons, preparing flags, all things that sounded quite plausible. It didn't feel like we were being set up for something. These all sounded like things that the Viet Cong would do. And I ended up writing a story based on what they told me. But what we asked them, what we were most interested in was, can you take us into Viet Cong territory? And they said, well, we can't do it. Yep. Sorry.
Well, Jacques, before we start going into that phase of the story, I like to set it up a little bit more because
Sure.
the place is the Mekong Delta, which Presumably, South Vietnam should have been under South Vietnamese control, but yet this place that you had this meeting was within view of the main roads and I think even a South Vietnamese military post, was it not?
It was. First, when we met these two men, we simply drove up, which was, I was always surprised that they were so open about talking to us, even though that clearly would draw attention to them. And then the next time we would visit them every couple of weeks just to keep this connection going, so that once the ceasefire started, we could go into Viet Cong territory. At one point, one of the men had shaved off all his hair and was dressed as a monk, and as if this sort of change of identity was going to protect him. I never did get him to explain why he did that. They were, careful about some things that they would not talk about, and we didn't always meet at their house. But so they were taking some precautions, but not as much as I would have expected. In the Mekong Delta, the South Vietnamese army controlled most of the towns, but out in the countryside, they had relatively little control. It was very hard to know how much they controlled, and the U.S. Embassy would put out maps, but we didn't know how much we could believe in those maps. And when we finally did get into Viet Cong territory, I was astonished because this was within a mile or two of the main road through the Delta. And then, as I'll explain, the things that we saw there showed a very permanent presence. This was not something, that was controlled by the South Vietnamese army during the day and by them at night. This was total control.
And it was highly unusual, was it not, for the National Liberation Front, the Viet Cong, to even talk to a Western journalist, right?
Right, and the ceasefire changed that. The ceasefire was announced, I think it was on January 30, 1973. I then heard that the Viet Cong were flying flags in the areas they controlled to say, "We're here." And I thought, well, that's really interesting. That I can probably use that. And we had agreed that on the third morning of the ceasefire, we would go and see our two friends and they would take us in. And so we went to see them early that morning. And they said, well, actually, the police activity has been much greater than we expected. So it's too dangerous for us to take you in. And so we said, well, what if we walk in on our own? Will we be in danger then? And they said, no, you won't be. So we got back in our car, continued driving down this main road, I think it was Route 4, through the Delta, and we saw some Viet Cong flags. And in the first village where we saw them, South Vietnamese troops, the ARVN, were fighting to get them taken down because that was a huge embarrassment to them, particularly since they were so easily visible from the main highway. So, and we even saw another journalist who was covering this. But rather than stop and cover this skirmish, we just kept on going, and we were looking for flags where there was no fighting taking place so that we could then walk in. And we eventually found a place in Dinh Thuong province where there were flags flying in a distant tree line, maybe half a mile or a mile away from the main road. And so we walked out to a farmer, and there were rice fields between that tree line and the highway. He was working in the rice fields. And we said, we'd like to take some pictures of those flags. Can you tell us how we can get close to it? And he said, yeah, if you go this way, I can guarantee your legs, meaning that there were no mines along the way, which was reassuring. But he was rather cautious. But he did give us that very valuable bit of information. And that required walking back to the highway and then entering through the rice fields in a different way. And we did that, and it was getting hot, and Veronique had a cold, which made it hard for her. And we had to walk on the retaining walls that were made of mud between the rice fields, which wasn't the easiest way to walk. But we finally got to a point where the our path stopped, and there was a lagoon in the way. And we saw a Vietnamese man with a boat at the other side of the lagoon. And so Lam, the interpreter, asked if he could come and just take us across. And he did. And so we did that. And then he saw that Veronique was really tired, and he asked if we'd like to rest in his house. And so she lay down there, and he gave us something to eat. And there were a bunch of kids running around. And we said, yeah, we just want to take some pictures. And after a few minutes of resting there, we said goodbye very politely. And he was very sweet. And we kept on going. And then we were surrounded by a bunch of children, which was interesting. And then the children disappeared, and we had the sense that we were being watched. And then everybody came out, not just children, but women, men, and greeted us. And we said that we were journalists. I think we'd agreed that I would say I was Canadian and we would speak French, just in case being an American was not a good thing to be at that moment. But they said, well, would you like to see our village chief? And we said, of course. And so they put us back in a sampan. At this point, the man we'd been talking to, who said he could guarantee our legs, appeared, and his reticence was now gone. He was now in Viet Cong territory, which clearly he was a part of and comfortable with, and he was now smiling, much more comfortable than he was before. And he took us in his sampan down a canal, where within a few minutes we saw, the proverbial Viet Cong soldiers in black pajamas carrying AK-47s on the side of the canal, just looking at us. A sight that I don't think any journalist had seen before without that rifle being aimed at them. That was just jaw-dropping for us. And we met the village chief. We were just amazed that all this was so close to the main road. The village chief asked for our business cards, of all things, which we were happy to give him. And we explained that we were journalists. And at this point, I felt I could tell them that I was an American. That was no problem for him. And he took us on a tour of what he said were places that had been damaged by South Vietnamese troops since the ceasefire began. Well, that clearly wasn't true. We saw bomb craters filled with water. The bombs clearly had landed there long before the last few days. But we were just so impressed that he was so congenial. And we walked all around. We saw a cemetery with red stars on each stone for National Liberation Front soldiers. And it was astounding to us that you couldn't see anything more permanent than a cemetery. They clearly controlled this territory quite completely. And he invited us to stay for the afternoon. And then we said, well, let's have dinner. And he took us to a cleared rice field. And in the middle of this rice field, there was a table, and they brought out this wonderful meal. And at this point, I was able to ask him questions like, well, how does it feel to be talking to an American after fighting against them for so many years? This was a man, by the way, who had lost his thumb fighting against American troops, and yet it seemed quite capable in every way. And he said, I've almost memorized this because it was so remarkable. We believe that there are two kinds of Americans. There are the imperialists, who we have fought for many years, and they have laid waste to our country and damaged it severely. But there are also people like Martin Luther King and Jane Fonda and the women's movement, and we want to thank them for their support. Well, here was a man in the middle of the Mekong Delta, as far from the United States as you could get almost, who knew these names, something that very few Americans could rattle off the names of 2 or 3 Vietnamese. He'd probably heard these names listening to Radio Hanoi. but even so, it was quite impressive. Um, and then, as the as the meal concluded, we they invited us to come to what they called a peace ceremony in our honor. Um, and so we began walking what turned out to be several miles along these retaining walls between rice fields. And there was a Viet Cong soldier, two Viet Cong soldiers assigned to each of us, one in front, one behind, to catch us if we fell, which we sometimes did. They were barefoot. We had our big army boots on. And you could see that in this situation, being barefoot was a lot better. But we kept on going. And then we were shelled by artillery. And it seemed like it was quite close at first. And there were, as we had walked, there were more and more people who gathered behind us to go to this ceremony. By that time, there were probably 100 people walking behind us, some of them screaming, diving into ditches, clearly terrified. But I think this was what's known as H&I fire, harassment and interdiction fire, that the South Vietnamese army just fired at random into areas that the Viet Cong controlled. We had wondered, were they aiming for us? They'd probably seen our car on the side of the road. Is that what was happening? But I don't think that's what was happening. And they told us that the shells had landed a couple of 100 yards away, that nobody was injured, which was somewhat reassuring. So after a few minutes, we went inside another house to rest for a little while, which had a display of a big Viet Cong flag in what you'd call the living room, and an old man with a long beard who lived there stood very proudly beside it. There seemed to be a lot more enthusiasm in this village for the Viet Cong than you would find on the other side, and in support for the South Vietnamese army. Corruption seemed to reign, and South Vietnamese soldiers never looked like they were excited about what they were doing, but rather that they had no alternative. And so this was impressive. Well, as we got close, yeah.
Well, Jacques, before we move from that village, if we were standing there beside you and we're looking around, what would we see?
There would have been rice fields in the distance. Sometimes as we walked, we could actually see that highway. It was flat, a lot of trees, if I remember correctly, palm trees, but mostly just flat agricultural fields.
And the trail that you were traveling on, there were some booby traps along there, were there not?
There was. At one point, there was marked off with, I can't remember what it was, rope, I suppose. And clearly these were booby traps, and and the sign said danger. If there were an attack, the sign and the rope would have been removed so that a South Vietnamese or American soldier could have tripped across that and probably killed himself. Yeah, those things were around.
And I think one of your guides told you to step carefully, did they not?
Yeah, but we trusted the path that they were taking us on, so I wasn't worried about that. In fact, what in retrospect seems so surprising is how little fear I had at the time. It felt like we could do this. It felt comfortable isn't quite the right word, but I didn't feel endangered. If anything was going to kill us, it was going to be South Vietnamese artillery. It wasn't going to be these guys. They wanted a story that would show that they were human beings, that they weren't bloodthirsty villains as they were portrayed in a lot of the American press.
So as you're traveling along this trail, what happens next?
we then started hearing something on loudspeakers, which was another astonishment. And as we got closer to this place, we even heard our names being announced on these loudspeakers, which was pretty impressive. And we reached a clearing in the middle of a rice field, and there were several thousand people at this clearing. And at the front, there was a stage with a National Liberation Front flag as a backdrop for that stage. And what were happening were skits that made fun of the South Vietnamese government that were being acted out. And we were told to go sit in the front of this group. And we sat down with the village chief and we watched this for a while, and Long would translate. And again, all this was within a mile or two of that main road. And we just couldn't believe that they could be so open about what they were doing. And I said, well, what happens if South Vietnamese shell you? And he said, if it happens, it happens. But, there are all kinds of theories about this. And one of them was that very often at that stage in the war, the two sides would agree to miss each other. And that may have been what happened. You could lower the level of casualties with these kinds of accommodations. And actually, it was only when Americans entered the scene that the level of violence went way up, because the Americans had no sense of these accommodations, weren't interested in them, were interested in killing as many Viet Cong as they did. And that's when the violence would go up by an order of magnitude or more. In any case, we sat at this in front of the stage. We were once more amazed that this was happening. And after an hour or two of this, the village chief said, well, would you like to meet some high-ranking cadres? And we said, of course. And by this time, it was close to midnight. And we just kept on going. We were put back in a sampan. The soldier who was guiding the sampan was singing to himself down a canal. So it was clear that their control of this area was total. They weren't afraid of revealing where they were. At that point, I was a little worried. Geez, he's singing to himself. Is that all right? But clearly it was. And after 15 minutes or so, they delivered us at another house where we got out, and we met these two cadres. One was dressed in black, the other was in white, and so I called them the black and white men, because they would not answer any of our questions. All of their answers were highly rhetorical. We got no information from that, and they would just hit their points again, and they would say things like, we hope that you will make clear that the ARVN, the South Vietnamese Army, is committing one ceasefire violation after another, and that you will report the truth to American readers, or in Veronique's case, French readers. And we assured them that we would report the truth, but we didn't get much out of that other than seeing these two guys, which was pretty remarkable. After a couple hours of that, we were taken to another house to rest for an hour. And then they said that they would smuggle us back to the Saigon side. The idea was to get in another boat before the sun came up, so that we wouldn't be easily seen. They were going to have an old woman guide this boat to the regional marketplace. And once we got to the marketplace, she would just disappear into the market. But along the way, we would have to pass 4 or 5 checkpoints that were controlled by South Vietnamese troops. And at the last one, we would have to just walk right by it. And we were told, just act as if you have every reason to be there, that this is totally ordinary. And so we kept that in mind. But things didn't go as they'd planned. The soldier who was supposed to take us had fallen asleep in this house, and we were supposed to get up at 5 and get started. And I did not sleep at all. It was too exciting to sleep. And I finally at 20 after 5, I had to wake this guy up and say, don't we need to get started? And without really knowing what his reaction would be to be awakened by an American. But he woke up and we did get going. So we're already a little late. We got in this boat with an old woman. And just after we got started, the motor stalled. And now we were starting to get a little anxious. And it took her about 10 or 15 minutes to get it started again. But she did. And then she went a little while and the motor got fouled in floating plants. And we had to go through it all over again. And that happened. And another time there were fish nets that it got fouled in. And after 2 or 3 times of that, we were concerned. The sun was coming up. We could be seen. We passed a boat coming in the other direction with a Vietnamese man and woman. Our eyes met, and they acted as probably as they had learned to do, as if this was quite normal, and kept right on going, even though I'm sure they could see that Veronique and I were not Vietnamese. But anyway, we'd been given Vietnamese conical hats to cover ourselves as best we could, but that only provided a little bit of help. So finally, we got to this last checkpoint, and we sort of just very confidently strode past that checkpoint. I don't know if they even noticed us. They might not have, and nothing got in our way. So we reached the marketplace. The woman disappeared. And then we thought, all right, now we need to get back to Saigon as quickly as we can. We went out to the main road, found a bus that was going to Saigon. Now, it got on the back of the bus while South Vietnamese police were walking around the front of it. We had been told by the Viet Cong village chief that our car had been towed away by South Vietnamese police. So we knew that they knew that somebody was in there. And so we were afraid that the police were looking for us, but they weren't. They didn't seem to be. They never looked inside the bus. And when it took off, after about half hour of sitting there, we breathed a huge sigh of relief. Another hour or two, we were back in Saigon, and I began writing the story and was up until 2:30 the next morning writing it, wondering a little bit if the Vietnamese telex operator who would have to type out this story and send it would agree to do so when he saw what it said. But it all went the way it should. And the next day there was, the LA Times had a headline above the masthead that said, "We are friends, Viet Cong tell visiting U.S. newsman." And this long story of mine, which, of course, I was thrilled about. One casualty of this trip was that the new camera I'd bought I had failed to load the film into properly, and so all these extraordinary photographs I thought I'd taken turned out to be nothing. So in place of them, an artist at the LA Times had drawn his version of this staged setting when the revolutionary skits were going on that looked kind of like they were cowboys. It just looked sort of laughable. But in any case, the story ran. I then wrote 2 more stories about the trip after that. And it's certainly the most amazing day of my life.
Extraordinary. And how was the article received?
Well, I think for a week or 2, I was quite well known in Saigon. And other journalists immediately wanted to do the same thing. And it was another 10 days before anybody could figure out how to do it. And eventually they all started going in to this same village until the village chief finally said, "Enough journalists, I don't want any more coming. I've got other things to do." But it was received quite well, except by the South Vietnamese government, which eventually made their displeasure known, although not at first. That began a long string of exclusive stories that I did. involving my finding political prisoners who'd been tortured by South Vietnamese troops. I can tell you about this if you like. And also, we were smuggled inside the prison ward of a province hospital in Quang Ngai province, the most embattled province in South Vietnam, not far from where My Lai occurred in that province.
Well, tell us about that, getting smuggled into there.
Okay, this was a story I did with Martin Woollacott, who was a wonderful Guardian correspondent. I was looking for, my editor had asked me to write about political prisoners. So I was trying to figure out how to do this. And I heard about these two Quaker volunteers in Quang Ngai province who were working as hospital workers. And so I thought, I think they might be able to help us. And so we got on a plane, flew to Quang Ngai, went to see them, and they were extraordinarily receptive. And because they were hospital workers, they were able to go into the prison ward. And what they told us was that in this ward, many of the women had been tortured by electricity with electrodes attached to every sensitive part of their body. And this experience was so traumatic that they would often have convulsions when reminded of their experience. And those convulsions could happen days, weeks, months, even years after the actual torture. And so I was obviously interested in that. And when they would have the convulsions, they would writhe and twist and just lose control. I started asking one of the, and this for some reason happened only to women prisoners. It did not happen to men. I started asking one of the women about this. And as we began talking, another woman near her went into this convulsion. Just the suggestion that I'd started caused her to go into a convulsion. And
so this occurred while you were actually in the facility,
in the prison ward, where it was filled with beds. There were beds almost touching one another, with not much room for anything other than beds. And there were straps of cloth tied to these beds. These convulsions were so common that when somebody had a convulsion, they would tie their arms and legs to the strap so that they wouldn't hurt themselves. And that's what we saw happening here. But that one woman set off, 5 or 6 others. And so it looked like bedlam. It was just shocking, beyond imagining. And so that became another story that I wrote. And then the other one about prisoners that was just equally remarkable was about 13 men who had been kept in the most notorious prisons in South Vietnam on Con Song Island. These were called the tiger cages, because the only entrance to them was from the top, where there was a metal grate, and the prison guards could dump things on them, including lime, which made their skin burn, and feces. Terrible. Just, they were treated terribly, and they were in shackles for periods from 5 to 10 years. And one of the things I had done was, when I was looking for political prisoners, was to go see a Catholic priest in Saigon who was known for trying to keep track of them, for making sure that they just didn't disappear within the South Vietnamese prison system. And I was always a little surprised that he was able to do this. And the only explanation I could come up with was that Nguyen Van Thieu, the premier of South Vietnam, owed too much to South Vietnamese Catholics to arrest a priest. Otherwise, I think he would have been another one of those political prisoners. But he was keeping track, and he told me to expect a phone call from someone who wouldn't give his name, but his name, but would tell us where to go to meet some of these prisoners. And a week or so after one of our conversations, I did get a phone call, and this anonymous voice said, go to such and such a hospital room in the city of Cholan, which is the city that is next to Saigon. And so for this story, I went with Ron Moreau, a friend of mine who worked for Newsweek, who spoke fluent Vietnamese. It wasn't right to take Lam on this trip. It would have put him in even more danger. And after the Viet Cong story, we agreed that he should lay low for a while, a couple of weeks anyway, because he could have been in much more danger than we were. The worst at that point that could happen to us was that we'd be expelled, but he could have been arrested, imprisoned, who knows what. So I didn't take him, but instead I went with Ron Moreau, who was a wonderful friend and an excellent Vietnamese speaker. We walked into this hospital room, and there were 13 men, all of whom had totally atrophied leg muscles. They'd been shackled for so long that their muscles had wasted away, and they could not walk. They sort of dragged themselves along the ground with their arms, and their bodies were covered with scars, which showed they'd been beaten over and over again. And yet what was most amazing about them was not that they looked defeated or broken down, but their utter confidence and even a kind of almost joyousness. They at one point handed me a poem that they'd written about a fellow prisoner who had died as a result of a beating. And the poem's last lines were, we wish you could be here to share your joy with us. Well, this was, not what you would expect. And these guys, wanted to be posed with pictures with their legs to show what had happened to them as we put our arms around them. They were just as upbeat as you could imagine. And we said, well, what are you doing in this room? Why aren't you in the tiger cages? And they said, we were released conditionally. We were told, we were taken to Bien Hoa, another city not too far from Saigon, and told that the things you cannot do are to go into Saigon and talk to American journalists. So, of course, that is precisely what they did. And here they were talking to us. It happened that there was an American doctor who examined them, and I was able to find this doctor, and he was able to confirm that what they said, his wording was something like, their description of their experiences were consistent with their condition. In other words, they weren't making this up. And here was an American doctor confirming that. So that was another powerful story, I think, that I did.
It kind of reminds me of Viktor Frankl and his book about, his surviving in the camps in the Holocaust.
I haven't read that book. So I can't really talk about that. Was it like the Holocaust? Well, the numbers, of course, were nothing like what they were in the Holocaust, but half of the soldiers of the prisoners in the tiger cages died. So in that sense, it's quite comparable. Yeah.
Yeah.
And he was
he wrote about the strength of the human spirit. If people had a purpose that they could survive and actually not necessarily thrive, but have that kind of attitude that seemed to be displayed by those people that you saw.
Well, it seemed to me that they had gone through death and come out the other side. That's the only way that I could explain it, because they were afraid of nothing. And a couple of the women prisoners in Quang Ngai had that same attitude. One girl, she was 18 years old, she'd been tortured. She said, I'm afraid of nothing. And she said it with such confidence that I believed her. Yeah, there are people for whom that happens, and they're pretty remarkable.
Let me switch gears a little bit on you. What is the strangest thing you ever came across?
Um, well, after I was expelled from South Vietnam, I just went to Cambodia and covered the war next door, and was there for the last 6 months of 1973. And then, as things began to crumble in Indochina in early 1975, I was sent back to Phnom Penh. I couldn't go back to Vietnam because I'd been expelled, so I couldn't easily get back in the country, but I could go back to Cambodia and was there right up until 2 or 3 days before the Khmer Rouge came into Phnom Penh and completed their control of the country. And in those, it must have been the last week or two. It was probably the last week, at which point the Khmer Rouge had really surrounded Phnom Penh, the capital. And I would each morning just go around to all four fronts, and you could do all that within a morning because they were all so close to the city. And as I was doing that, I came across one spot where there was an encampment of Cambodian soldiers, and there was some kind of disturbance. There were 100 or so people standing out in front of it talking, and I was with my Cambodian interpreter, and so he went and tried to find out what was going on, and came back and told me this hard to believe story, which was that these soldiers had been at a place called Kampong Salah, an outpost that was surrounded for 7 months by Khmer Rouge troops, far from Phnom Penh, and they were defending it. And during those 7 months, they would get food dropped by helicopter. And their officers, they said, were quite corrupt. They would eat the caviar and Chateaubriand with nice wine, while they were given hardly anything to eat. On top of that, they weren't paid during this 7 months. And in the process of that period, the place lost its tactical significance. There was no longer any reason to defend the place because now all that was left essentially was defending Phnom Penh. And so they were taken out of there, taken to Phnom Penh, and told to go back to the front around Phnom Penh. And they refused. And they said, we won't go until we're paid. And the paymaster, an officer who was there, for reasons that amounted to suicide, pulled out his pistol and began shooting at them. And in return, they killed him. And then they ate part of him. They ate his lungs, liver, heart, calves, and biceps. It turns out that there is Cambodian lore that says if you eat your enemy, you gain your enemy's strength. We'd heard of this happening before, but to eat your own officer is something I'd certainly never heard before. And I went and saw the body lying there with strips of flesh missing, and talked to somebody who'd said he'd eaten parts of it and seemed quite comfortable with the fact. That is probably the most, strange doesn't begin to cover that word, but unworldly thing I saw, I suppose.
Wow. Well, take us to Phnom Penh in those days leading up to it being taken by the Khmer Rouge.
Well, first I should say, when I was there in 73, it had the sense of being almost a sideshow, and that's the title of a book about it, to Vietnam. And it wasn't quite as necessary to cover combat because there was less at stake. There were no American soldiers involved. The Phnom Penh army was well known for being pretty incompetent. It seemed like it was just a matter of time before the Khmer Rouge took over, but in 73, that didn't look like it was going to be imminent. There was a point In August of 73, when American bombing of the Khmer Rouge stopped, this was a decision by the US Congress that had a lot to do with Nixon's weakening because of Watergate. And as part of that, the decision was made, legislation was passed to stop US bombing of the Khmer Rouge. So they gradually were gaining in strength, but at no point did it appear that Phnom Penh was directly threatened, although we certainly thought it could happen anytime soon. But when I went back in 75, it was definitely happening. And I think I was on one of the last planes by Cambodian Airlines to fly into Phnom Penh, and the way it would fly in was what was called the falling leaf technique, where rather than just come in at a very gradual landing and expose the plane to being shot down, it would go in at a more vertical angle and with a very heavy landing. And then the plane would stop and you would run to get to shelter, because that could have been shelled, and a lot of that airport, Pochentong Airport, was shelled at that time. So it no longer felt like this fun place. And Cambodians had this wonderful sweetness about them. It was nice to be there. Journalists enjoyed being there. It felt like a respite compared to Saigon. A lot of journalists there weren't quite as ambitious as the ones in Vietnam. There was just more of a sense of relaxation. But by 75, that was all gone, and it was fairly grim. And we stayed in the Hotel Phnom, which had previously been known as the Hotel Royal until the monarchy was overthrown by Lon Nol in 1970. And the hotel was gradually falling apart. You could no longer have your wonderful souffles for dessert, and thoroughly things were getting pretty dark. And a little bit scary, because it wasn't clear how we would get out of there if the time came. The U.S. Embassy eventually put out word that it would evacuate not only all journalists and diplomats, but anyone else who we knew who felt unsafe if the Khmer Rouge took over. And I told this to my interpreter. This is about the worst decision I ever made there. But I told this to my interpreter, and he came back the next day and said that he and his wife, and I think he had 6 kids, would like to leave. And I said, "Are you sure? Because if you leave, you'll forever be a foreigner wherever you end up. You won't have the kind of connections that you have here, the kind of family support." I really did not realize how evil, how bloodthirsty the Khmer Rouge were, and I blame myself terribly for that. And as a result of my saying that to him, he decided to stay, and I've regretted that ever since. In any case, he stayed and helped right up until the end, and we were told to expect the next morning that something would happen involving the U.S. Embassy. They didn't want to say that this was going to be the evacuation, because then the word would spread. Who knows what could happen? There could be thousands of people trying to line up to get on helicopters, as happened later on in Afghanistan and Saigon. This was about a month before Saigon. And that morning, we were told, all right, the evacuation is on. Go to the U.S. Embassy. And we did that. We got on flatbed trucks, of all things. And I guess that's what they could round us up to take to a cleared soccer field where U.S. Marine helicopters would land. And so we were driven through the city on the backs of these trucks where anybody just just could look in and see all these Westerners mostly on top of these trucks and figure something strange is going on. We got to this cleared soccer field. Um, Finally, a helicopter landed. Marines got out and immediately uh, surrounded the perimeter of the soccer field to provide some security. And we got into a succession of helicopters, um, along with the acting president of the Cambodian government. So he was fleeing. Lon Nol, who had been the leader for 3 years, had already fled a couple of weeks before that, but he was on the same helicopter we were on. And we were taken out of there to um, a U.S. Navy ship in the Gulf of Thailand, and then taken to Bangkok eventually. So that was another notable event of mine that I went through. There were some Cambodians on that helicopter. This was the end of a phase of their lives, and a change into quite a different phase. I don't think anyone realized that the Khmer Rouge would come into Phnom Penh and within a couple of days empty the city entirely at gunpoint and move everyone out into the countryside and carry out killings that amounted to maybe a quarter of the Cambodian population over the next couple of years. An atrocity that's as bad as the Holocaust.
Yeah, when I was there last October, visited those the killing fields and the infamous school that was turned into a torture chamber.
Yeah.
But one thing that puzzles me greatly is, and I think you saw it too, the Cambodian people are some of the nicest, friendliest people you can meet. And I could never get my head around how they also descended into the killing fields. Do you have any thoughts on that?
It's something we talked about and thought about a lot. The Cambodians had this wonderful sweetness, as I mentioned. They also had a kind of explosiveness. They maybe were the two sides of the same coin. Cambodian soldiers would sometimes try to shoot down the moon. They did crazy things. Whereas in Vietnam, you had the sense that Vietnamese had I'm now engaging in gross oversimplifications, but Vietnamese were more sure of themselves. They had a greater sense of who they were. They were less likely to do something crazy. They were far more calculating. And that made them more trustworthy in a sense, although probably not as endearing as so many Cambodians were. But the sense we had was that there was a way in which Cambodians, which had probably suffered from colonialism even more than the Vietnamese did, they'd come to rely on foreigners. The Vietnamese were never, that wasn't something they wanted to do. And foreigners were always cast as the enemy, and that's the main reason that the war in Vietnam ended up as it did. But there was much less of that in Cambodia, and there was a sense of relying on other people to help us out. There were pleas from the Phnom Penh government, just as the end was coming, to please the United States, do what you can, stop this. These are all just little shreds of ideas about what the difference was between these two cultures, but they were very different cultures.
Very different results. Let's go to India. Tell us about your experiences there.
I was stationed in India after all this. It started in 1974, and then it just seemed like uh, a good assignment, and I really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed India. In some ways, it was like the peacetime equivalent of war because you never knew what you were going to see each day. Just such a rich culture and just so many remarkable things. And during the first few months I was there, um, I just did story after story, none involving these sorts of life and death stories. Then I was sent back to Phnom Penh and covered the fall of Phnom Penh. From Phnom Penh, I went to Laos, covered the fall of the coalition government there. We journalists were told that our visas would not be renewed. So rather than expel us, they just let our visas expire, and then we all had to leave. I went back to Bangkok to just rest for 2 or 3 days, picked up a paper and saw that Mrs. Gandhi, the Prime Minister of India, had been convicted on election malpractice charges. So immediately, and that meant that she could lose her position as prime minister. So I rushed back to India, and 10 days later, she declared a political emergency, said that there was a conspiracy to cast her out of office, and threw 100,000 of her political opponents in jail, a number that could probably only be reached in a place as populous as India. She also suspended all civil liberties, including freedom of the press. And so suddenly we were told that we had to submit all stories to censors. I tried doing that once, and what came back was laughable. I mean, there just maybe a quarter of the story was left. And I knew that I wasn't going to do that again. And so instead, I began either smuggling stories out of the country, finding people who are leaving the country, giving them the stories, asking them to take the story to the local telegraph office wherever they arrived. And for stories that weren't immediately timely, that would work. But more often, I would dictate the stories by phone to Los Angeles, sometimes at 2 or 3 in the morning. The government had cut off every other means of filing stories. The usual way was through telexes in those days. We couldn't file through telexes. We couldn't do anything. But for some reason, they never thought to block telephones. In those days, the telephone service was horrible. And so I would get on the phone, and then inevitably I'd lose the line 3 or 4 times, but I'd always get it back. And I always felt that Indian operators were on our side, that they wanted the story out. And I never lost a story, quite remarkably. But it was only a matter of time before the U.S. Embassy in Washington or the consulate in Los Angeles saw that there were all these stories that did not look as if they'd been censored. I mean, among the stories I wrote was one about the cult of personality of Mrs. Gandhi, another one about an interview with a politician who had gone underground to avoid being arrested. And to do that story, I met some people who I'd arranged to do this story with on a street corner. They then blindfolded me, drove around for an hour, delivered me to a house where this politician was staying. I interviewed him, then got back in the car, blindfolded again, driven around for another hour, dropped on another street corner. And that's how I did that story. So there was that level of tension going on. Well, I'm sure when that story appeared in the LA Times, that couldn't have made Indian diplomats in the United States too happy. And eventually I was told that I was being expelled, as I'd been from South Vietnam. I think the difference was that in South Vietnam, I had 72 hours to leave. In India, I knew that it was coming, so I was prepared, but I was given 24 hours to leave. And went out to the airport whereas I was something of an adversary to the U.S. Embassy in Saigon because of all the stories I'd written that upset them there. In this case, U.S. Embassy officials came with me to help me. to make sure that nothing bad happened to me, and I was able to leave the country. But I've retained a great deal of affection for India. I did manage to go back in 2001 for a book that I was writing, and so my expulsion was not permanent once regimes changed, and Mrs. Gandhi was eventually killed by her Sikh guards many years later.
The character traits and skills needed for a correspondent to cover conflict areas, what do you think those are?
Well, the first thing that comes to mind, and this applies not only to conflict areas, but to all journalism, is a deep sense of curiosity. The best journalists are those who have a natural sense of curiosity and just want to find out, well, how does this work? Why did that happen? What's this all about? And so that's the first thing I would say. I think it takes, for war correspondence, it takes a relatively calm demeanor, not someone who's going to be exploding in fear or any kind of emotion, but rather who can be relatively self-contained when conditions are not feeling safe or comfortable. And I certainly knew none of this about myself when I started, but I did find out eventually that I did not panic, that I could keep my head, and that served me well. It didn't mean, I should add, that I didn't have deep emotional experiences as a result of everything I'd seen, but I could wait until sometime when it was safe to sort through them. And after I came back actually from being a foreign correspondent and met my wife and started telling her these stories, that I would cry as I told her story after story. And that was something that was just waiting to happen, and I really needed to do that. And in fact, for a long time after coming back to the United States, after 5 or 6 years as a correspondent, I was depressed because I just couldn't imagine what I could possibly do that could begin to touch what I'd already done, what could have as much meaning, as much potential significance, not to mention all the excitement. And it took me a really long time to figure that out. One way I did that was to write a book about it. You mentioned it, The Mark. And once I finished that book, I felt that I was really done with the war. But yeah, I did eventually realize that, to me, environmental stories were just as important as covering the war. And I've spent the last 20 years writing them, particularly about water. I've written a book about dams and their social and environmental impacts. And I've now writing another book about a region, the Klamath Basin, on the California-Oregon border, which has been the most embittered river basin in the country, and is now the site of the world's largest dam removal project. I realize I've gotten away from answering your question, but just to go back to what it takes to be a good war correspondent is just an ability to absorb information fairly quickly, to see the larger picture. But these are all skills that journalists of all kinds should have. And ultimately, particularly now when I think journalists are in so much more danger than we are, and journalists have become targets, it takes a great deal of courage to do that work. And I would say a lot of them have far more courage than what I had.
You've taken all those skills, and for the past 20 years, you've been working, covering issues regarding water. What's that all about?
I got interested in this when I got a report back in 1999 or 2000 that was just about global water scarcity. And I began looking into this and finding out that in many places this was already an issue. In other places it was going to be an issue. And I wrote what turned out to be a 16-page cover story for Harper's Magazine about global water scarcity. And as I did that story, I realized that at the heart of almost every conflict over water, there was a dam. That dams were really magnets for conflict. And so that led to the book I wrote, which was about a book of narrative nonfiction about three people in different parts of the world contending with the social and environmental impacts of dams, which are just absolutely enormous. They have caused the displacement of probably 100 million people who lived in areas where there are now reservoirs and who often were indigenous people with no rights to speak of around the world, forced to move, sent to resettlement areas where living conditions were far inferior to what they had before. And I was able to describe that in this book. And then the environmental consequences of dams are enormous. They basically destroy rivers. They change the temperature of the water, the flow of the water, the ability of migrating fish, such as salmon, to go up and down the river. Their consequences are profound and not really appreciated. And so I've spent a lot of time writing about that.
What is the name of the book?
It's called Deep Water, The Epic Struggle Over Dams, Displaced People, and the Environment. That was published by Farrar, Straus and Giroux, won a nice award. As I think that was published in 2005, I think it's still worth reading.
And you're continuing to work in this area, right?
That's right. I've written a lot of, dozens and dozens of pieces. I'm a contributing opinion writer now at the LA Times, but I'm writing a book about the Klamath River basin, which is extraordinary for the number of different issues that it calls into play. Back in 2001, when this conflict exploded, it was farmers and ranchers on one side and tribal people and commercial fishermen on the other. The tribes and the fishermen trying to save salmon, which in what had been the third largest salmon fishery in the United States, and now salmon were down to 5% of their historic level. And on the other hand, there were water diversions for farmers and ranchers, some of whom had been there for 80, 100 years and felt they'd been told they would always get this water. And suddenly it was cut off because of the Endangered Species Act, trying to protect salmon in the lower basin and two species of suckerfish in the upper basin. And that conflict has never really been settled since. The dams are coming out, which will help the salmon enormously, but the other aspects of the conflict are still going on. And that's what this book is all about. I should say that it focuses on two people and tells the larger story of the basin through them. One is a very courageous tribal former chairman and tribal council member who, in the midst of this crisis, when farmers were just hating Indians, knocked on the doors of farmers' houses to tell them that he could really commiserate with their plight because Indians had suffered so much. And that was a very courageous thing for him to do, particularly given that he had two long black braids. He was instantly identifiable as an Indian, and yet he managed to do that. The other is a woman rancher, a woman named Becky Hyde, who, as this conflict was going on, bought a very degraded piece of ranch land in order to turn it into a model of how to do ranching in an environmentally appropriate way. Filled it with sensors, got support from environmental groups so that they could monitor everything that was happening on this piece of land. Really did make it recover. And she also created an easement for it, which required all future owners of this property to aspire to the same level of environmental soundness. And then she made the trustees of the easements the tribe that used to live on that land. Well, when she did that, she got death threats from other ranchers who were just outraged that she could make any sort of agreement with the tribes who they regarded as their enemies. So these are two very courageous people. Jeff Mitchell is the tribal member, and that's I'm telling their stories and the story of the basin at the same time.
Any final thoughts that you have about what you've experienced throughout your life? Any lasting life lessons that you could share with us?
Well, first of all, I feel extraordinarily fortunate to have been able to have these experiences. To be a journalist and to be a foreign correspondent is essentially to be handed a license to ask anybody any question that you want. And that's something that most people don't get to do. And to see as much of the world as I've seen, and to learn from it, these are just invaluable things, and things for which I'm forever grateful. It's it's certainly changed the way I see the world, changed the way I see what's happening in the United States. When you see a government like the one in Cambodia collapsing, you start to compare it to what's happening in the United States, and it makes me take a longer view in some ways, but in other ways, feeling a sense of urgency about the threat to continued democracy in this country and the threat to the existence of just about all of us because of climate change and other environmental catastrophes, the loss of biodiversity. It's made me look in unusual places for stories, places where that might not get an immediate headline, but that are just as important, maybe more important. So writing about this remote river basin is an example of that. That's what comes to mind right now.
Jacques Leslie, who first landed in Saigon on that assignment, if you had an opportunity to go back and tell yourself any advice of that young journalist who was stepping off the plane, what would you tell
him? That's a good one. I suppose the first thing would be is, keep calm. Don't panic. Follow your curiosity. Understand that everyone you meet has a story, that there's always stuff beneath the surface, and that if you dig long enough, you will find things that will surprise you. One of the things I observed was that the journalists who succeeded over a long period of time were not always the most skilled, the most brilliant. They were the ones with the most determination, the ones who could persevere. And so I would say, if you can hang in there, if you can show your perseverance, you'll probably do well.
Outstanding. Well, Jacques, this has been a privilege and a real pleasure to speak with you. And thank you for sharing all of this. It's remarkable. And I hope one of the books that you write in the future is your autobiography. I think a lot of people would benefit and enjoy such a book.
Well, thank you. I feel like I partly did that with the Mark. I'm not sure I want to go back into that. I feel like I've covered myself, and actually, if I had to write the Mark all over again, I would do it a little differently. The idea that does appeal to me, although I doubt I'll ever do it, would be to rewrite the Mark with what I understand now compared to what I did when I wrote it. I think I was far too consumed with myself when I wrote that book, and now I feel what happened to me is not nearly as much of much interest as what I was writing about, all these extraordinary events that I witnessed.
Well, I think both are important. It's the human element of how these events shape us, hopefully give us more wisdom, more depth. But, there's a price to pay when you see such brutal things, how, harshly people can inflict pain on others. And then in the midst of that, seeing people who persevere, people who do good work. So it's all there.
Yeah.
All right, Jacques. Thank you very much for sharing all this.
Well, Michael, thank you. It's been a pleasure to talk about this. I've really enjoyed it.
Yeah. All right. Well, you keep safe and we'll see you down the road.
All right. Bye-bye.
Thank you for joining us. We'll see you down the road when we get together again, share a glass of whiskey, and hear more stories of adventure as told by those who live them. Until then, check us out at michaeljreinhardt.com, where you'll find more of my work as an adventure photojournalist. Photos, videos, and articles of interesting people, mysterious places, and exotic cultures from the wild places of the world.